Well, to get this conversation started, what does that mean to talk about the South or to talk about being Southern? And to get it started, I want you to do a quick exercise for me. So on your tables, you're going to see these little note cards like this, all right? All right, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to just take a minute and think of the first words that come to your mind when you think of the South. All right. Well, these are good. Well, I've done this at a number of different conferences, and these are the kind of answers that I get. So you're seeing some of the ones that y'all came up with. Churches always comes up big. Racism. Let's get some banjos. Something about culture, music, food, and I'm glad, grit straight out of the gate there. That's always one that comes up. Moonshine. Last one I did, Moonshine and Waffle House, came up really fast and multiple times. So I don't know, if you identify with that. But interesting, right? Some of the first things that come to mind when we think of the South. Some are rooted in very real experience and history in the South. Others are tied up in the myths around the South, right? As one anthropologist said, there's no region in the country that is more loaded with myth than the South. And in fact, one of the South's many identities is that it's such a mythical place, so bizarre and different and hard to understand that nobody outside the region could ever understand it. And of course, that was what William Faulkner said is, if you're not from the South, you just won't get it, right? And there might be some truth to that, but I think that's also historically played a very useful role to say that kind of thing, right? Because anytime a Southern leader was approached about slavery, Jim Crow, assaults on labor rights, what was the response? Well, that's just a Southern thing, right? You wouldn't understand. That's how we do it down here. That's how we do things down south. Well, I think our job today is to prove Faulkner wrong, that we can start to figure out the South. That's not the full story, and we can pierce through the Southern mystique. You can also get some other quotes. I thought this was a good one from Faye Dunaway. I'm Southern, I know neurotic behavior. But also, I think our job then is to pierce through this idea that there is a Southern mystique. And I always like this quote from Howard Zinn, who wrote a book called The Southern Mystique from his time working with SNCC at Spelman College in the South, that we created this myth about the South and that we can pierce through it. And I think one of the other essential backdrops of this entire conversation is another one of my favorite quotes from Malcolm X, which is that we also tend to lay a lot of the blame for our country's ills on the South, which are in fact national problems. Thanks a lot. So I think we can do this, right? Going into lunch, we can start to figure out the South. Sound good? And I definitely won't go into lunch. I'd be about as popular as a skunk at a lawn party if I tried to do that. So let's talk a little bit about what is the South. And just to get us on the same page, and so it also has very important political implications. And, the first thing to know, sociologists, linguists, political scientists, geographers, one, they have a hard time agreeing on this, and when two, they do come to agree, it usually the South has a way of changing and throwing everything out the window. But they put a lot of work in trying to figure out what the South is. So who can tell me what this map is right here? Any guesses? All right, I'll give you a hint. If you go to a grocery store and you buy a sugary beverage that's fizzy, or maybe it's artificially sweetened, it's like this. What do you call it? Oh, pop. What did I hear? I heard a pop. Sean, you spent time in Michigan. What do you call it? Pop. All right. What other people? What I hear? Soda. All right. What do all these people down here call it? Will. It's a Coke. Doesn't matter if it's Pepsi or Diet Sunkiss. It's a Coke. You would be blown away by how much research has been done on this very question about what people call fizzy drinks. And they found that it's one of the most effective cultural markers for figuring out what the South is. At least that's so they say. Here's another one. Who here likes country music? Oh, thanks. Some of y'all got like country music. You're like my dad. He'd say he didn't, then we get in the car in the morning after he came home from work, Dolly Parton blaring out of the radio. Chances are, if you listen to country music, if your city is mentioned in the song title, chances are you might be from the South. How many here are active on Twitter? All right. So if you were active on Twitter in a parallel universe, or if you are active on Twitter, would you be more likely to tweet about beer or about church? Church is a loaded word, but Coke. Well, apparently, if you tweet about church, you're in the South. And if you tweet about beer, you're from other parts of the country. So these are part of the cultural markers, they say, right, to figure out what the South is. Of course, language is another one. This is like from the American Encyclopedia of English Language. They talk about the dialects. Charleston's got its own thing going on over there on the coast. But of course, this is one of those ones that is changing, right? So when you have, who knows what is the city that has the most languages spoken in it outside of New York and California? Any guessing? Atlanta, the Atlanta metro area, right? So these kind of ideas about the language, about how that identifies the South, are the kind of cultural markers that are being called into question. Somebody mentioned churches, and obviously this is one of the clear defining cultural things about the South, and it's very important because obviously it has very big political implications, right, about how that's mobilized and used in politics. Although that's traditionally been associated with Baptist faith, what's the fastest growing religion in the South today? Catholics, right? And so that's changing as well. Well, another way to get this question is to ask people, do you think you live in the South, right? And there's a study that was done for about 20 years at UNC, and they would ask people, do you think your community is Southern? Are you in the South? And they would ask people all over the state, and these are the answers. Now, anything interesting about this? You get 90%, people saying that they are living in a Southern community. Any of these strike you as interesting? Texas? Florida, right? Everybody, I know, I always see this hand wringing. It's like, is Florida part of the South? Is that really? Where 90% of the people who live in Florida think they're living in a southern place. I think that's significant. And I think especially because the South is wrapped up with ideas about politics and racial history, right? And that people think they're living in that environment, I think, is very important. But we're also talking specifically about politics here today. And so let's talk just a little bit about how you define the South politically. Government agencies and all that are a little bit useless on this one. Here's the American National Election Studies Commission. They include these 11 states right here. Exit polls, when Wolf Blitzer brings up his hologram and everything on CNN, this is what he's talking about. He's got these 13 states. They throw Oklahoma into the mix. Census Bureau. Everything but the kitchen sink, right? Oklahoma, Maryland, Delaware, D.C. So when you see a figure saying that 70% of all coffee drinkers are in the South, probably they're using the census definition because it's a huge pool. But we want to narrow that down, and I think the way we look at it, start with the first time the South identified itself as a political entity. And when was that? Well, here's 1861, the map of the Confederate States of America. And you look at those 11 states that were part of the Confederacy. And really, that was when these states started forming a coherent identity. They went through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, World War II, the Southern Strategy of the 70s. There was something that united these states over that period. And if you have any doubts about whether that legacy plays out today, what was the basis of the slave system in 1861? King Cotton, right? And this is cotton production. A geographer overlaid that with the 2008 election results. And you see that that is still the basis of black political power in the southern states. Follows that pattern remarkably closely. And so, kind of drawing on all of this analysis, what we've come up with at the Institute is to look at these 13 states, the states of the Confederacy, plus those border states of Appalachia. It really seems to hold up rather well about similar patterns about environment, labor rights, incarceration, spending on education. And the important thing to understand, obviously there's huge differences within the South, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today, is just how it's playing out in different ways in the South, different political contexts, but there's something that also unites these states, and I think that's going to be part of our analysis today. Any questions? Okay.